Basically, what I'm going to go over is just some of the techniques I use to make concrete and asphalt with plaster. Or like you said, the Durham's wood putty, which works pretty well. For a very simple, easy way to make asphalt and concrete, if you don't want to go to all this trouble, get a can of Rust-Oleum, the texture paint, the multicolor, the black speckled for asphalt, which comes out looking just like this, which is really a nice asphalt surface. You can do a little bit of weathering, take some paint, add the crack lines that have been filled with tar, just do some little texture stuff. Or for concrete, a nice overall texture is the white or the tannish color. You can use that. But for concrete, the surface is a little rough when it's sprayed out of the can, but you can take some fine sandpaper just to smooth that out a little bit. And you can do some weathering with either the Woodland Scenic concrete color, or they have asphalt too, or an alcohol and India ink wash just to wash it and give it some texture. Add some scribe lines for joints and whatnot. It's a real fast, easy way to do fast concrete, but it doesn't look as good as if you mix your own with plaster, which is what I'm going to do now. Basically, start with a piece of glass, any size you need. I'm just going to do a small piece. Take some wood strips, cut the thickness that you want your slab to be. Build a frame. Concrete, as you know, is made out of a mix of cement, sand, and stone. If you use the plaster as is, it's real smooth. It's not really a concrete texture. So the best way to get around that is add sand to the plaster mix. You can either add just fine sand and a little bit of coarser aggregate if you want to go that route. You can use model railroad ballast. They have different sizes for different scales. This I think I just got from the beach, just a scoop of sand, and it can be sifted out with any kind of anything you have around to get all the big chunks and clumps and shells and whatnot. But there's sand and dirt everywhere. So for this demonstration, I'm only going to use the sand, which is really all you really have to do. You don't really have to go to the extent of adding the coarser aggregate too. It's not going to really be seen. So basically, you start with a frame, and you don't really have to cut your pieces exactly to the size that you need for square, because you can overlap the pieces around. You can adjust how you're gonna the final shape you're gonna have. Probably easier to demonstrate than it is to explain. Take a little bit of either contact cement, a sealer of some kind, and attach your frame onto the glass. Only use a spot here and there, maybe in the middle and both ends, just a little spot. All you want to do is hold it in place for long enough for the plaster set. The first one I did, I used silicone on the whole board, and it just didn't come off, and it was just a headache. After it's set up, I wasn't able to get it off. I wasn't able to get the plaster out without a problem. But if you arrange your sticks, just kind of overlap them, and you can work on, well, the shape you want. If you want a rectangular shape or square, just overlap your pieces like this. I'll make the whole thing and I'll stick it up in the air for you.
Yeah, make the whole thing and then give it to me at the end.
Yeah. So if you, as opposed to lining them up, exactly with the corner square, if you do it this way, all right, I'm over the edge here anyway, so I gotta move it. If you make your frame like this, you can move it and shift it any way you want. You can make it either more square or more rectangular without really having to cut exact lengths of wood to make a perfect square.
Us having the hangover make it easy to pull those little planks at play.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. That's very true. Because I gotta wait for this to just harden up a little bit.
Shit, having a hangover make it harder.
All right, so basically this is your frame. While this starts to set up, you can start to mix your plaster. Now, you can estimate how much you need for the form you're gonna fill, which I could never do. I've never really determined how to successfully figure that out. So I just kind of eyeball it, and I usually don't have enough. Or I have, over the amount I need, and I waste a whole cup of plaster, but that just goes with the territory. Always mix the plaster by putting the plaster in the water. Don't do it the other way around. If you start with the plaster and add water, you're gonna get the clumps, and it isn't gonna mix right. Another thing I like to do is color the plaster. Not really the color that you're gonna finish with necessarily, but at least you'll have a color that if it gets chipped or nicked somewhere along the line, you won't be seeing the white of the plaster. There'll be some kind of a color in there. And you can add the color either after the plaster is mixed, but I like to add the color to the water. If you add the color after the plaster is mixed, there's a tendency that you'll get like a marbleized, as you start to mix it up, you just get a marbleized, threads of color, and it's not going to be uniform. So for something like this, I'm just going to start with maybe this much water, see how it goes. Plaster of Paris is good. Hydrocal is better. You can get that at a model railroad store. It's same as plaster, only it's a lot harder when it dries, and you can handle it better. Durham's wood putty also works, but I think that's a little more expensive than plaster.
Yeah.
Basically, I'm gonna try not to make a mess here, which I already did on the box. Pour some plaster, get that ready. Now, in coloring the water, I like to use tempera powdered pigment, but that's kind of hard to find sometimes. You could use artist acrylic paint, black or tan or brown. You could actually use this asphalt top coat, any kind of black pigment, but I do like to use the powdered pigment. Of course, I'm starting to run low here. I've had this for years, and I'm starting to run out. But you can really make it dark because once you add the powder, it's really going to lighten up, as you'll see when I mix it up. This has a lot of chunks in it. Hopefully they'll disperse. Color the water. Mix that up.
So we can see.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Can everybody see? Matt's falling asleep, so he won't see anything.
I'm snoring.
Yeah.
If
So basically, this might be too dark, I'm not sure. It's always a hit or miss depending on the volume of water and the volume of the plaster and the amount of pigment you put in. But we'll just see what happens with this. So we're just going to add a little bit at a time. And this is probably going to end up being a lot more than I need. It only takes a little bit of water. And just keep adding the powder a little bit at a time. Do some mixing. And you can already see this is getting lighter. It's still pretty dark. It's a pretty dark gray, but it's getting lighter. Once you reach the point where when you add the plaster, it doesn't dissolve fast, you're near the point where you want to be. Now, it's a little better to add a little less than a little more, because if you get to this stage and you keep adding and it gets real thick, then it's going to harden up real fast and you're not going to be able to pour it in your mold. And anyway, it's a little better to sit for a little while anyway, just to settle out and just to get the air bubbles out of it. While you're stirring, you're going to get a lot of air bubbles. Or at least I do. But you can, while this is sitting, I think I'm going to need more. I'm going to mix up a little more. I don't know if you can see through the side. I can see looking right down at it, and you'll see it when I pour it, but this is getting a lot lighter than it was. So I'm just going to leave it at that consistency where it just sort of starts to drip off. It's not it's not too thick and it's not too loose. Hopefully I'll have the time here to. Now, at this point I add the sand too. That's, I meant to do that, I almost forgot to do that. There's no real formula as far as how much sand to put in. Just add as much as you, till you start to feel it and you start to see it texture-wise. I usually maybe use about a quarter of the volume of what I've already mixed with sand, but you can adjust that as you go along. And you'll feel it. You'll feel the grit and you'll be able to see the fine, the fine sand. You can hear it while I'm stirring here. You can feel the grit. At this stage, if you also want to add a coarser aggregate like the ballast, you could add that too, just to get that mix. Now, when this is mixing up, you're going to get a lot of bubbles, which we'll take care of later, hopefully. Now, as a little extra bonus for the sand, and I'll show you how I'm going to do this later, what I do, take a little brush and just smear a little bit on the glass, and you can see the sand in there a little bit. So I just kind of wet that. Then take the sand and sprinkle sand on the surface. Now this is upside down. The surface that we're going to be working with is the flip side of what we're casting. And I'll show you why I'm doing this after it dries. Just kind of sprinkle a fine layer on the glass. I got a couple large pieces in there that you can leave in or take off. Now, after you get a layer of the sand, it doesn't have to be even or regular. In fact, you don't really want it to be real regular. Just random sprinkle. Then you're going to put in your plaster. Now, at this stage, because you don't really want to disturb the sand that much. It's gonna disturb a little bit while you're pouring the plaster, but you don't wanna just pour it because, you know, the sand will just go to the edge and clump up. Take an old spoon and just kind of lightly cover it. So you're gonna end up like something like that, just all the way around. So the sand's not really gonna run when you finish the pour. It's just to kind of hold that surface sand in place. Now this is a little dark, but here again, this isn't the color you're gonna end up with, but you could, but I'll show you that later. All right, after you get this done, just kind of finish pouring, and I think we sort of did okay here as far as the amount. Try not to go over the edges if you don't have to, because it'll get a little sloppy, because it's gonna hump up anyway. The capillary action is that what it's called. You're gonna kind of hump up in the middle or away from the edges. So when you're at this point, take another piece of wood. It's gonna act as a little squeegee, or you can kind of bang the glass just to settle everything in. And you're gonna use this as a little squeegee and just kind of flatten out the back. Now, there's a little bit that's coming off. This, I could have probably added just a little bit, but this isn't too bad. This is coming up pretty good. And just kind of take that off to the side. Now, if you're a little low somewhere, here's my plaster, and you're still able to work with your plaster a little. If you're a little low, you can fill in the low spots. You know, just take some of the stuff you've already squeegeed off to fill in corners or whatever you might have to do, and do your squeeging again. Just kind of squeegee it out. Just kind of run it off. That's why we have all these newspapers. Now, you might see a lot of air bubbles. This doesn't really have a lot of bubbles. This isn't too bad. But if you do, just kind of tap the glass, and you'll see the plaster kind of move like a little bit of Jell-O, and you'll see the bubbles starting to come up to the surface. Or you can slide it over the edge and just kind of hit it with your thumb a little bit like that, and you'll see the bubbles start to come up. This really doesn't have a lot of bubbles. I'm surprised. Usually there's a lot more. So basically, that's how you leave it until it dries. And when it dries, just like the cooking shows, this is what it looks like. This is the surface that was against the glass. You can kind of see the sandy spots, the swirly sandy spots. Matt, you see that? So it just kind of looks like this. Depending on how you squeegeed the back, this is how the back looks. This doesn't look too bad either. Now what I did with this, I experimented while it was still wet. I sprinkled sand on this side too, which, you know, I just want to see how it would work, and it doesn't look too bad. This is smooth. If I do this now, it might be dry before we finish. But while it's still wet, just kind of from up on top, you know, real high, just kind of sprinkle some sand in the wet, and that'll give you a little bit of texture, and it'll give you a little areas to scrape off, which I'm going to show you later too. So if for some reason you don't like what the front looks like, you can use the back. All right, got it?
If you're cranky, you'll always make it.
That's right. All right, so this is what we have now. We just have a slab of plaster. For a sidewalk or a street, let me add too. If you're gonna do do asphalt is a larger aggregate in asphalt, use more sand and a different color, basically. It's just you'll be able to see the aggregate more, and if you just paint it black or dark gray, it'll look like asphalt. Let's see. All right. Maybe I'll do the coloring first. If you've done a fairly good job with your mix and you're satisfied with the color, this almost sort of looks like concrete as it is, this color. But if you start to fool around with different colors, it'll absorb into the plaster. I always use like a water-based color or the alcohol wash, India ink. As a sealer, you can either use a flat, like a clear. Well, let me show you what would happen. If you, for example, do the alcohol wash or any kind of color, it'll just absorb in a very unnatural pattern for concrete. This you could almost get away with as is, if you're lucky, but if you might want to add a little bit of color, let me show you how that'll absorb if it's unsealed. I'll do it on the back. I'll use alcohol and India ink. This is just, like I said, alcohol and India ink. Proportion-wise, it can be whatever you want it to be. I use this to weather wood, or you can highlight with it. You use a lot of this, right? If you use it as a weathering agent on wood, it just gives you like a nice, like a silvery gray look. If you do it on plaster, I'll do it on the back, it'll absorb on the unsealed plaster so fast that you'll get the lines and streaks. It's going to be uneven. You know, it absorbs into it like so fast you can't really get an even. You know, there's going to be overlap with your brush strokes and whatever. So it isn't a bad idea to seal it or paint with a primer or the concrete color, the Woodland Scenics concrete color, just so if you do add another layer of color, it isn't going to absorb into the plaster unrealistically. Like on the front here, there isn't any way that I could really hide that and kind of smooth it into the, you know, if it's unsealed. But let's see. If you choose to do this without adding any sand, you can add a little bit of texture by using the texture paint on top of this. I've done that sometimes too. Either if you don't have sand or you don't want to mess with it, you can use your spray on the plaster. If it's a little too rough, you can just take it down with sandpaper. But the reason I like to put the sand in the surface is to weather it, which you'll see on some of those little examples there. If you scrape some of the surface off where the sand is underneath, and I'll hand this around, we'll pass that around. If you scrape it with a blade, you start to scrape off the smooth surface and you start to get the sand exposed underneath. And the texture ends up looking like deteriorated concrete. And I'm going to pass this around. Basically, I'm just in the sand areas that you can see. And I'm going to go overboard on one here. You can do it on the edges if you want to do a curve, but this will give you an idea. If I
thank you,
I'll take that, yeah.
Oh, wow, yeah.
But that gives you the texture, the depth, like a little pothole kind of thing.
That's fantastic, yeah.
And it just gives the appearance of concrete that's actually deteriorating. This is starting to harden up. Good. Okay, now in attaching your concrete, oh, here's an example of what it looks like when you get a lot of air bubbles on the surface, on the glass, and you turn it over, you can see all these little air bubbles here. But those aren't necessarily a bad thing, because in using your razor blade, you can just sort of eliminate those and just make it look like little, little divots in the concrete. I had to do that a lot on the concrete I had on the tire store downstairs. I had a lot of bubbles in that plaster for some reason. And I just used a scraper and just kind of toned it down to make it deteriorated. But it comes out pretty good. When you scrape off the surface, it just really does look like deteriorated concrete. Now, when you're laying this out on a diorama base or either a card display, that anything that you would use the concrete under, you could just lay a slab, but the expansion joints and the seams and whatnot, if you add them by simply scribing in a line, it'll look like a scribed line on a piece of plaster. Because you're going to get an even line, or if the line is wavy, it's going to be equally wavy on both sides, and it isn't going to look like two slabs of concrete that are right beside each other. So what I like to do, and I'm just going to do this real fast and random, score it. You can snap it like a snap styrene. Score it and snap it. Yeah, see, it kind of breaks in the middle. This is kind of thin, but actually this is good. This is a good thing. I can use this as a learning tool, as a teaching tool. But actually I didn't scribe it enough. You can either, you can go all the way through, or almost all the way through. This is a little too thin to work with. It's a little too flimsy. I like to go with about an 1/8 inch, which in 25th scale is about like a 3-inch slab of concrete. You'll get these little irregularities at the seams that you can either sand down or smooth off or chip or something. And just make some square. I'm not going to measure this real accurately. But you just score it and snap it. Go a little bit through, just kind of pop it like a piece of glass, and just end up with the squares like you would get in nature. Now, to glue them on, this is a little, well, I'll use this too, but arrange your sidewalks. Like you can see, this has the little, where the sand was, it's kind of deteriorated. You could use that as one of the curb edges or something. I don't have a pair of pliers, but I can just knock that off with my finger. Now you can use Elmer's glue to stick this on. That'll hold the plaster in place. And basically put on a little bit of glue. And like I said, I'm just gonna kind of randomly put these squares in here. This could probably. If anybody has any questions while while I'm going along, shoot. That little chip. Now, I'll pass this around too. I'm not really spending a lot of time on the edges here to clean these up, but, you know, this will give you an idea of what is going on here. I'll just do one more. This little piece that broke off, well, it's a little too small, I can't do that. Try, that's not gonna work. All right, I'm just gonna leave that off for now. But basically, the lines in between the sections you're gonna fill in later with sand or, you know, weeds and grass. I can show you how to do that if we have enough time too. But basically, this is what the sidewalk is gonna look like. Now, I haven't scraped any of the surface, but it'll give you an idea what the seams look like. Let's just pass that around too, please. It's a lot more realistic looking than just having a piece of plaster that you scribe and just lined up.
But
Now,
you're not measuring, I mean, you.
I'm not
you-
now, but,
okay,
yeah, but,
you-
like in this, yeah, I measured the squares. Now, a piece like this, well, let me show you. What I like to do also is, if I get a square, let me try to get on a square without breaking it. This is thin stuff. Before I glue it, and I'll show you a couple of ways. Some just pop there. So, right, that's just pop, but that's all right. Before I put it on a base, I'll just use this. And I'll say this is just the one section I want to do. I take it and I break it, either accidentally or otherwise. And when you glue it down like that, it actually looks like a crack that you would get in concrete when you match up the areas, because that's exactly what you're doing. So you can either do a crack like that, you can add more, take off more pieces and just fit them in like so. I'll hold this up when I get it glued in. Another thing to remember about concrete, and I've seen this done on dioramas that doesn't look realistic. When a concrete slab settles and breaks, it'll do so all the way across. It doesn't. Asphalt, when it settles, you'll get a spot, like a crack that'll start, and it'll kind of make its way over like your windshield. It'll do a little bit at a time maybe and not go all the way across the slab. But with concrete, it'll go all the way across the slab, or a corner, or from side to side, or, you know, whatever. But the whole thing is gonna crack, which is what, I mean, I've seen guys who have just done the scribe lines on a piece of concrete that scribe it, you know, like halfway across. But that isn't, that's not how it works. So let me just show you this too.
The lines, I saw you took the razor blade, put down between.
Oh.
Is that a good gauge for a crack?
No, the only reason I did that was because I had a little nub that was sticking out and I wasn't able to get the pieces close, so I just kind of.
Looking at that, it looks like, you know, the width of a razor blade.
Yeah, you could do that. I'm not really that fussy. I just kind of, I just leave a little bit of space because I'm going to either use weeds or sand to fill that in anyway. But if you want to measure, you know, that accurately,
Well, I mean,
you can
just
do
a
that.
quick.
Yeah, just a
Got
quick
it.
eyeball. Just make sure there's a little bit of space between it. Now, how are we doing for time? Do you have a watch? Oh, okay, we got time. Okay. All right, now this is what it looks like when you snap it and score it and you glue it in place. And when you do that, now you can put a little something underneath it, a little, even like a piece of paper, just to lift up one edge of the crack. You know, like how when you're walking on a sidewalk, you see the tree roots that have lifted a concrete sidewalk, and it's all irregular. That's the same thing you can do with this. Now, let me move this over. What I've also done, I save all the little pieces all the reject pieces, and I like for future projects. I can either smash them up, or I have a couple of pieces that I've used for curbs. You can either do the scribing and then cutting, or you can make a form that's as wide as a curb. It'll be about 4 inches in real life, 4 to 6 inches. Do your form, just a long thin one, and you have all your curbing made up already. Cut it into lengths like you would find in real life. Stick it. And here again, the sand, the corners especially, you can use your razor blade to scrape off the surface and expose the sandy texture underneath. Just do that. And you're adding the curve. Now, I'm not doing any of the coloring on this. You can either do the coloring before or after, if it needs any more color. So this is just a quick idea how the curbing looks. You're adding the different sections of curbing. Now, a lot of times you see curbing that has totally deteriorated, just crumbled and just kind of washed into the gutter and whatnot. How to do that? When it's in place like this, when you glue it in place, take a hammer and do that. Okay, and you can do it as much as you want. You can do it. I do it sometimes on the concrete itself, on the sidewalk, and like that. For really deteriorated, cracked, banged up old concrete. All right, now how do you hold it in place? Using the model railroad method of water and white glue. Now you get the pieces where you want them, like these little, all the crumbly stuff. If you don't have enough of the crumbly stuff, make some more crumbly stuff. Just bang it all to pieces and get it where you want it. Water and a little bit of detergent. This acts as a wetting agent. The detergent in the water, when you spray it on, that allows the glue mix to spread on the surface. If you don't use the wetting agent, when you drop on the water and glue, it'll bead up on you. Like so. Well, I don't know if you can see it, but it just kind of lays there and beads up, and it runs off. It doesn't disperse. If you spray it with water and the detergent, and all you really need is just a little bit of detergent. Well, actually, it has to have something to bead up onto, but when you put the drop on, it's going to spread and it's going to level out, which I can show you better on this. So basically, you're going to very carefully get the finest little spray bottle you can. Otherwise, when you spray it with, if you're nearby or you got a real big spray bottle, the stuff's just going to blow away. All the fine stuff's going to blow off. But just kind of start, just to wet it. I mean, obviously, I'm holding this up, so it's going to fall off. Just make sure it's real wet. Then put your glue. And you see how that's just really absorbing into it right away and spreading? I'm not sure if you can see it from this angle, but now you basically, after you put the water, put the glue and water on, it'll be a mess. It's going to look terrible. It's going to look like a big soggy mess. But when it dries, that's why I brought this as an example. That whole thing was done with the water and glue. After it hardens up and dries, it gives the appearance that it's loose, but it's really on there hard, and it holds up really well.
So it's pretty much just a binding agent that binds it all together.
Right, yeah, right. And if you find some things that are loose while it's still wet, you can just add more glue. If it starts to bead up on you a little bit, just add a little more spray, and it'll disperse. Now you do the same thing with sand in the cracks. Like you got, where's my sand? Now you can either use dyed sawdust, which I use a lot of. I dye sawdust, or the ground foam, any kind of model railroad cover, ground cover. Sand, do the same thing. You sprinkle the sand in the holes, which really kind of doesn't make your cracks really look as wide. It kind of blends it in together a little bit. Now,
Is that a question?
oh yeah,
Could you use tile grout?
yeah, the powdered grout.
Tile grout.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, yeah, and I've used the plaster too. That I've colored the dry
Yeah.
plaster with the dry pigment. Yeah, and the grout you can get in different colors. Yeah, yeah. I'm surprised. That was a pretty good question. Yeah, good job. Now you just, do the same thing, fill it in with sand or grout or model railroad stuff. Do the same thing, spray it. You can really do a lot. Spray it, and it isn't going to fall out, now that it's wet. Do the same thing with the glue in your cracks. Well, in these cracks. Don't glue your crack. And if it starts to bead up a little bit on the edge, just add more water and it'll disperse. And again, when it hardens up, you can see the example here, what it looks like in between the cracks. Now, depending on the age that you want to represent of whatever it is you're doing, like an old parking lot that hasn't been used, you can add some weeds, some higher weeds. If it's a lot that's always in use, you won't have any weeds. But the height and the extent of the foliage you have in the cracks is going to indicate to the viewer how old that the scene is you're modeling. So that's a way to get an idea over to your viewer. So basically, can I hand that around just for the sake of looking? Now, for this, I think we're at a point where we can get this up. I usually leave it overnight. If it's hydrocal, this hardens a lot faster than plaster, and you can take it out of the mold a little quicker. But we'll see how this works. Just kind of scrape off the edges, which I should have done while it was still real wet, so you know. So it's not overlapping the wood. Take your tail, like you were saying, and just kind of pull it or lift it. Now this is a little soft, but the forms are coming off kind of okay. Now if it sticks onto the glass, you can take either a piece of thread and just kind of work it underneath and loosen it up. What I do too sometimes, I don't have it with me here, but before I put anything on the glass, I use like the cooking spray, Pam, just to put that on the glass first.
So to get that yellowing color you got on there, do you use butter pans?
Yeah, use the butter pan. But now, if this were harder, it would come off in one piece, but it's kind of breaking up because it's not really hard enough to take off yet. So it's just kind of
All that
flaking
work.
off, which is actually good though, and you can save the pieces and do that. Or, keep them in your, the scrap pile. But after this really hardens up, you should be able to take a thread or something and just kind of work it, pop it off. But, which is why really I like to use in fact, I'm almost out of hydrocal, that big 50-pound thing. Is that thing?
Dentist grade?
Yeah, was that what it was? Was that the dentist grade?
Dentist grade, yeah.
That's good stuff. But basically, that's it. It's just, I like to use, in anything I build, I like to use a material that's as near the actual material in real life as possible. And the closest you can get to concrete, I think, is plaster. And just by adding sand and a little bit of stone and fine stuff like that, you can get a pretty good, duplication of concrete. With asphalt, it's basically the same thing, but darker. There's not really that much of a
But the
difference.
scale you work out based on the math. I mean, if it's.
Yeah, it's like, there's nothing really, real complicated. You just kind of mix until it looks like what you want it to look like, I guess.
You know, you can tell if you makes too much, it ain't like you ain't gonna dry the rest of it out and use it for something else anyway.
Yeah, you can use it in your scrap pile. You can bang it all up with a hammer and make like a concrete pile I have on the gas station diorama, with little scraps that you're gonna color and mix and make little dirt piles and stuff. But basically, that's it. Anybody got any questions or?
Yeah. Oh, Ken. Forgot your name
Yeah.
already. The white glue will dry with a slight sheen. Do you spray that with matte or anything?
I've never really had it have a sheen when it dries. In some applications it does, but for some reason with the scenery material, like either the ground foam or even the plaster, I've never had it dry with a sheen. If you use the wetting agent, that'll cause it to spread and get so thin and absorb that it doesn't sheen. If you don't use the wetting agent and you have a blob of it on top and it dries, you'll get a little bit of a sheen maybe. But like this or anything else, I've never really had to seal it afterwards, or put a dull finish on it.
On the way down here, we was noticing on the asphalt out in front of us, I guess where the sun was hitting, there's like specks of glass in the asphalt. The person wanted to get that effect with, like, just fine fingernail glitter or something, just a little bit sprinkled in, or would that be out of scale, you think?
No, not really. I mean, asphalt, you've seen, I'm sure, all kinds of different size aggregates and surface textures and everything for asphalt and concrete.
Yeah.
I
didn't
think,
know what it was making it shine like that, but the specks that was just very silvery reflective.
it might have been just the angle of the sun on the,
The place that I asked that question many years ago when I saw it, because it sparkled like crazy, was the Ocean City, Maryland, at the very beginning of Ocean City, Maryland, the parking lot. And it was unbelievably, there's chunks in it. And I looked down,
Really
and I was
chunks?
looking at it, and we were all walking, I said, what the heck is the lights were just free? And I was like, what? And everybody, we were looking, I said, it's glass. And then, so I guess somewhere I looked it up, and that's what a lot of places, and they use different amounts or less amounts that are finer.
Yeah, just to add all kinds of.
But it sparkled like crazy. It was really beautiful. It was
I wonder if you could use like salt.
well-
That wouldn't
I think
sparkle.
salt
No, that
was
would-
all-
If you go to,
I was thinking like the little real fine.
Yeah, the glitter.
Like you use in fingernail.
Oh,
fingernail.
Yeah.
Michael's are a craft shop, they have
And the little
that,
tiny-
embossing powders.
Yeah,
and
embossing.
Oh, yeah,
Yes, that's
yeah,
it.
yeah.
My wife's got a bunch of that stuff,
Yeah.
and it's real, you can get it in different
Yeah.
colors and get it in
Well,
finer
the-
grades,
yeah.
and just kinda
Well,
sprinkle it in there.
the glue the heat sets it.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different things you can experiment with, I mean, that's the fun of the whole thing, just coming up with different things, and sometimes you hit something by mistake that's gonna look good, and, yeah, just keep on playing with it until it looks good, so.
Can you get a little variety by doing different points and then cutting sections?
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, you can get different textures, like if you want to indicate that there's a patch of somewhere, you could use, like a different, anything from the scrap pile with, different amount of aggregate in it. Yeah, I do that sometimes, it just add different pieces from a different pour, just to get a different texture and color.
Like with this right here, and you're using sand, but like with really cheap concrete, they use actually just big gravel and stuff like that. You could use the small gravel stuff you get for modeling, for train modeling.
Yeah,
put it
right,
there
exactly.
To make it look like a cheaper concrete, but still has the stones look in it, right?
And the good thing about the model railroad, the ballast, is they have, N scale ballast, which is real fine, and, moves up to HO, and, there's all different kind of size of the gravel in the.
Plus, if you go to the
The
dollar
bags.
store, they have where they have the floor arrangement, stuff like that, and they have that sand.
Yeah, for the
in
sand
different colors.
glasses.
They have it black, and it's almost like a glittery, and they have like sand colors and different stuff, and it's a different aggregate, and you mix
Right.
it together.
Yeah, I mean, that's half the fun, just trying to find all this different stuff to use that'll look good. But, I just happen to do a lot of dioramas.
Too, I can remember when they used to have concrete have like a coned surface on it, and finish it like.
Yeah,
did
like a brushed.
Sort of like you see the Japanese sand gardens.
Right, well, they do
used
it for
to
the
do
runoff,
concrete
right.
that way, little circles or, lines back and forth to give it some, especially in the northern areas where you got problems with ice and snow walking on the concrete,
Yeah,
they leave lines to give it some.
actually, what you could do there, just to get a brushed, like a broom finish on concrete, instead of working upside down, when I squeeged it off, I had a fairly smooth surface on top, and you can do that if you're careful. As it starts to set up, just use a wet paintbrush, a real fine brush, like a sable brush like I had here, and just kind of do your brush marks and use them, that side up. Yeah. There's all kinds of things you could do. So, I don't know. That's all I got. That's it. I'm done. Thank you.
So who's
Yeah, I'd like to thank most of you for not falling asleep.
are you raffling off the diorama?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.